Donald Trump is, for all intents and purposes, a foreign spy acting on behalf of Australia. And he should be treated as we treat spies in this country, arrested, detained without bail, treated as the threat to national security that they are, and held as long as is necessary. Since the Mar-a-Lago Trump stolen classified documents nightmare broke upon us 14 months ago, the nightmare within the nightmare has been simple and chilling. What if Trump took the secrets of the United States of America and shared them with foreign governments or foreign nationals or other foreign spies? And now we know that he has. And now we know that he has violated the Espionage Act, has given away information about our submarines that, according to New York Times sources, quote, potentially endangered the U.S. nuclear fleet. And the new mystery is, why has he not been charged with a violation of 18 U.S. Code Chapter 37, Section 794, gathering or delivering defense information to aid foreign governments? And why is he not now facing, quote, imprisonment for any term of years or for life, unquote? We know the name of the man Trump delivered defense information to. We know his nationality. We know when and where Trump delivered the information to him. We know what the information delivered was. We know that Jack Smith's investigators know about it and interviewed the man at least twice. And we know who the man in turn shared the top secret information with. It totals at least 45 other people, including 3 of his home country's former prime ministers. ABC News broke this story last night, and it is not just astounding. It is astounding that it has not and will not wipe out every other trivial news story currently being regurgitated by the compliant media of this country. ABC's sources report that in April 2021, which would be, roughly 3 months after Trump lost any protections of the presidency, real or imagined, a member at Mar-a-Lago, a balding Australian named Anthony Pratt with orange hair bearing a startling resemblance to a baby orangutan, approached Trump there, quote, looking to make conversation with him. Pratt is an Australian billionaire, head of Pratt Industries, one of the world's largest makers of corrugated packaging, based in Georgia. Pratt told Smith's investigators that he and Trump had discussed one particular topic before, so that was his go-to move in the conversation starting at Mar-a-Lago. Quote, he brought up the American submarine fleet. What Anthony Pratt says Trump told him about the American submarine fleet, Pratt would then share with 11 of his own company's employees, 10 assorted Australian officials, 6 journalists, and the 3 former Australian prime ministers, and there are 7 living former Australian prime ministers, so I guess we can count our blessings that the secret submarine information did not reach a majority of them, or reach Rupert Murdoch, or Nicole Kidman, or the late Dame Edna Everage. Pratt brings up the American submarine fleet, and let me just read directly from the ABC report, quote, according to Pratt's account, as described by the sources, Pratt told Trump he believed Australia should start buying its submarines from the United States, to which an excited Trump, leaning toward Pratt as if to be discreet, then told Pratt 2 pieces of information about U.S. submarines: the supposed exact number of nuclear warheads they routinely carry, and exactly how close they supposedly can get to a Russian submarine without being detected. While Pratt told investigators he couldn't tell if what Trump said about U.S. submarines was real or just bluster, investigators nevertheless asked Pratt not to repeat the numbers that Trump allegedly told him, suggesting the information could be too sensitive to relay further. A former Trump Mar-a-Lago employee then told investigators that within minutes of Trump telling Pratt began telling, well, everybody else in the world. The Trump employee told the investigators that he was, quote, bothered and shocked to hear Trump blurt out such secrets to a foreign national. Pratt and the Trump employee agree Trump did not show anybody any documents about this. Pratt insists he only told the Australian government, evidently everybody in the Australian government, evidently many who merely used to be in the Australian government. He only told them because he was advocating for his native country to buy the American submarines, and ultimately it did buy them. And contemporaneous with giving away the secret details of how stealthy they are and how many nuclear warheads they can carry, Trump also told Fox Business Channel that the U.S. has, quote, the greatest submarines in the world, the most powerful machines ever built, and nobody knows where they are. Well, Anthony Pratt knows where they are. And presumably the last three conservative prime ministers of Australia, Morrison, Turnbull, and Abbott, they know where they are, as do the 11 Pratt employees and the 10 officials and the 6 journalists. Trump gave away our nuclear submarine secrets to a guy who makes corrugated boxes. It doesn't matter if Australia has largely been a close ally of this nation. It doesn't matter if Pratt invested in plants in this country. It doesn't matter if Trump attended the opening of a Pratt plant in Ohio in 2019. It doesn't matter if, as the Times reports, Pratt is on the list of possible witnesses in Trump's Florida trial. It matters that after Trump was elected, Pratt bought a membership at Mar-a-Lago to gain access to the prostitute president of the United States. And he got the access, and he got it in spades. And he says he visited Mar-a-Lago 10 times. And he once had dinner with Trump and a U.S. senator nearby. And he got into the White House. While one of the prime ministers was there, God knows which. I wonder if Pratt keeps them straight in his own mind by remembering which ones he told about American nuclear submarine secrets and which ones he did not. None of that matters. What matters is Trump compulsively shot off his big bazoo at his crap shack country club to a guy who makes corrugated boxes. And he was overheard doing so by one of his employees at the club. By at least one of his employees at the club. God knows who else heard him that time. God knows who else heard him all the other times. Whoever with intent or reason to believe that it is to be used to the injury of the United States or to the advantage of a foreign nation communicates, delivers, or transmits to any foreign government or to any representative, officer, agent, employee, subject, or citizen thereof, any document, writing, code book, signal book, sketch, photograph, photographic negative, blueprint, plan, map, model, note, instrument, appliance, or information relating to the national defense shall be punished by imprisonment for any term of years or for life. It's espionage. Donald Trump committed espionage. He is not merely trying to burn down representative government in this country again, but in his spare time over these last 3 years, he has been committing espionage. And he is, for all intents and purposes, a foreign agent of at least one other country, Australia. And when we find agents of other countries who trade in information about how many nuclear warheads can fit into one of our submarines, or how close our submarines can get to the Russian submarines without the Russians finding out they are there, we arrest those agents and we keep them detained without bail. And if we can arrange it, we keep them there for the rest of their lives. And the government, no matter what the fallout to this might be, needs to arrest Donald Trump today for espionage, for spying on behalf of a foreign nation. And we need to keep him detained without bail. And instead of that, instead of hearing of Trump's arrest as the spy he is, we hear instead that Trump attorneys in Florida have filed a motion in Judge Eileen Cannon's court seeking to delay his trial for stealing those documents and giving them and the information they contain to everybody in Australia except Crocodile effing Dundee, He wants it delayed from May of next year until December of next year because the secure facility assigned to the case is not ready, and thus he cannot access the classified documents central to his case. And why doesn't he just get them from Anthony Pratt? And instead of his arrest as a spy, we hear that Trump attorneys John Lauro and Todd Blanche have filed a motion in district court in Washington to dismiss the entirety of the January 6th case because of something they made up called presidential immunity, which I guess you get from drinking bleach and eating light bulbs. Because trying to seat fake electors and overturn a legal election and usurp the presidency and stay in power illegally, they are, quote, within the heartland of a president's official duties, or at least within the, quote, outer perimeter. And Trump was only trying to enforce the election laws. And I have two questions for Mr. Lauro and Mr. Blanche. How much money is it taking to get you to represent a traitor and a spy like Trump? Oh, and secondly, did you get it in advance, you whores? If these infuriating attempts to stall so that the greatest criminal in American history can get away with it again were insufficiently enraging, Messrs. Lauro and Blanche have added that because the Senate did not convict Trump in his second impeachment after his coup attempt, that acquittal renders Trump, quote, absolutely immune from any prosecution for January 6th, which is exactly the opposite of what his apologists said in January of 2021, and exactly the opposite of what the Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell said as Trump was not being convicted, that these matters were properly within the realm of criminal prosecution and the criminal courts. And most infuriatingly still, instead of heading to jail as a spy, Trump may instead be heading to the U.S. Capitol to create another campaign stunt event by standing for the vacant speakership of the House. He says he'd fill the job temporarily until they can find a permanent one because he's a unifier. Or he's pretending to stand for the post until he realizes the Speaker of the House has to actually work and not just, despite the title, speak. Trump headed back to the U.S. Capitol, proving the oldest cliche that the criminal always returns to the scene of the crime. Honest to God, in a sane country, the debate right now would be a jurisdictional battle. Who among you gets to arrest and detain Trump first? The Department of Homeland Security? Or Judge Chutkan in Washington for violating the terms of his bail? Or Judge Engoron in New York for violating the gag order again? Trump, attacking the judge's clerk on Tuesday, told to not again do that or publicly refer to anybody on the judge's staff, slandered the judge himself on Wednesday, did that again yesterday, 6:44 a.m. Eastern. Another post on his crap shack social media, quote, a radical left judge who came up through Democrat club system. And then at 7:08, he had another brilliant thought, quote, a highly political judge. Judge Engoron, if you do not punish him, you are saying the law does not apply to Trump. And if you say the law does not apply to Trump, then it is no law at all. And you are merely increasing the chances that he regains power and uses it to punish anyone who crossed him. And I hate to tell you this, Judge, but that doesn't just mean me. It means you. This has been grim stuff so far, so I think we should let ourselves really enjoy the remainder of the news. The news that someone has picked up on the rather obvious Trump mistake, that if he paid taxes on a club that he owned on the basis that it's worth $26 million, and now in court he insists it's worth $1.5 billion, Trump probably owes the state of Florida some money. Congressman Jared Moskowitz of that state has written to the assessor of Palm Beach County, noting the slight discrepancy. It's just $1.474 billion. It's chump change if you're a balding, orange-haired Australian box manufacturer. If the property value of Mar-a-Lago is so much higher than it was appraised, asked the congressman, will you be amending the property value in line with the Trump family's belief that the property is worth well over $1 billion? Thank you, Congressman. Meanwhile, back in D.C., let me circle back to the speakership and this assumption that the Republicans, who have proved time and time again that if there are no more Democrats to attack, other Republicans will do just as well for Republican target practice, that they will actually elect a successor to Kevin McCarthy someday. Says who? They are so utterly incapable of anything except conflict that they let a handful of derelicts like Gates and Mace and Burchett and Bob Good, they let 8 scumbags grind their majority's time in power to a halt. Who are we thinking is going to compromise here? They may all be too afraid to turn Trump down, but this still assumes Trump is serious about being speaker, and I'm sorry, I don't see cash for him to pick up, or secret documents for him to steal as speaker, or, to put it in his terms, I just don't see what's in it for him. He's the sucker, isn't he? Also, we do not want the Republicans to elect a new speaker, because the little bow-tied snot rag they have in there now is an acting speaker, and guess what does not count in the presidential line of succession? Right now, that line of succession is Vice President Kamala Harris, and then Senate President pro tempore Patty Murray, and then a bunch of members of the Biden cabinet. Until the Republicans choose their next future ex-speaker, the line of succession is free of Republican scum. Good. 3 more legal larfs. Trump sued Michael Cohen for $500 million for allegedly violating attorney-client privilege. It was just getting to depositions. Trump was supposed to sit next Monday. Trump's withdrawn the suit without prejudice, meaning he can file it again later, only he won't, because it's not just without prejudice, it's without substance, but it's with a Trump deposition. Meantime, Sidney Powell was again eaten by her own kraken. Again. The judge in Georgia has denied her motion to dismiss her Trump 19 indictment based on prosecutorial misconduct that, like everything else she has ever spoken of, evidently only she could see. And best of all, as of yesterday morning, Mike Lindell was being sued by Dominion voting machines for $1.3 billion for defamation. And he was being sued by Smartmatic voting machines for something unspecified, but close to $1.3 billion. But then things went downhill for Mike. His attorneys, Lewin and Lewin and Parker Daniels Kybord LLC, have asked the judges in the cases to let them withdraw as counsel for Lindell and MyPillow. They are intimating that he has pulled a Rudy Giuliani on them, that he owes them millions of dollars in unpaid legal fees, and that now they will have to sue him and MyPillow. Well, sheet. Also of interest here, remember Madison Cawthorn? Remember what the other Republicans did to Madison Cawthorn? Well, I can tell you without fear of contradiction that they are now starting to do exactly the same things to Matt Gaetz. They are Cawthorning Matt Gaetz. So go make the popcorn. That's next. This is Countdown.
This is Countdown with Keith Olbermann.
Postscripts to the news, some headlines, some updates, some snark, some predictions. Dateline Washington, the Republicans are Cawthorning Matt Gaetz. Remember Madison Cawthorn, the far-right Congress troll who evidently went too far for his own party when he revealed drug-fueled Republican congressional sex parties. And the next thing he knew, there were 227 photos going viral of him wearing a dress. Gates led the ouster of Speaker Kevin McCarthy over the wishes of all but 7 other House Republicans, and they are ready to expel him from the Republican Party, along with the other 7 who voted against McCarthy, including Nancy, I'll even get out of bed for this, Mace. Congressman David Joyce of Ohio says, quote, if it was up to me, I'd vote for it. It's a waste of time having conversations with these people. He's so close. I never thought Congressman Leopard of face-eating city, Florida, would eat my face. While other Republicans have warned they will vote to expel Gates, not just from the party, but from Congress itself if he's found guilty by the Ethics Committee, the hints about that are now beginning to drop. In fact, they're beginning to rain. Former Mike Pence chief of staff Mark Short said, quote, to say he came here as a fiscal crusader, it's more likely he came here for the teenaged interns on Capitol Hill, unquote. Thank you, Nancy Faust. And former Congressman, now Senator Mark Wayne Mullen of Oklahoma. And seriously, Senator, what kind of name is that? Either you're Mark or you're Wayne. Anyway, Senator Mullen added, quote, we had all seen the videos he was showing on the House floor of the girls that he had slept with. He'd brag about how he would crush ED medicine and chase it with an energy drink so he could go all night, unquote. Gates's reply to that, quote, this is a lie. A lie? Which part, Matt? You mean it wasn't an energy drink? Thank you again, Nancy Faust. Do you see what we did there? Dateline Washington, why is this country going to hell or has already gone there? Reason number 3 or 4 out of the top 10, the news media has lost any understanding of what it is here for. Politico playbook on the Speaker of the House favorite, Steve Scalise. Always smiling and quick to joke, Scalise is the type of politician you end up drinking too much wine with at a steakhouse. You shouldn't be drinking wine with any politician, you Politico ninnies. Your job is to go cover them. Your job is to, if necessary, expose them. Your job is not, repeat not, never, to end up drinking too much wine with them at a steakhouse. And Dateline the White House. After biting yet another Secret Service agent, the Biden rescue dog Commander has been relocated. We do not have details. I am hoping they relocated him to become head of the Secret Service. Still, this does give Republicans the opportunity to finally boast that after 2 years of trying to do nothing else, they have finally gotten a Biden out of the White House.
This is Sports Center. Wait, check that. Not anymore. This is Countdown with Keith Olbermann.
In sports, Dick Butkus has died. There was never a better middle linebacker and never a National Football League player with a tougher reputation and never an NFL defensive player who more completely defined an era in his franchise's history. Born in Chicago, started at the University of Illinois, third pick in the 1965 draft, and 5-time first-team All-Pro in just 9 seasons for the Chicago Bears. Butkus died in his sleep at his home in Southern California. You will hear stuff like that all day today. But Dick Butkus was also intensely intelligent, well-read, funny, and scrupulously ethical in an era when that was not commonplace. I knew him. We sat opposite each other during a 5-hour flight from New York to Los Angeles one day in 1989 when he was doing color commentary for CBS football. And the moment he sat down, he pulled a book out of his bag and began to read it. During takeoff, over the East Coast, through the heartland, he was still reading this new football book that I had heard the NFL was trying to kill. It was about the history of the game and organized crime. It was called Interference by Dan Moldea. For several hours, all I heard out of Dick Butkus, sitting not 5 feet from me, was a series of profound grunts. Somewhere over, like, Topeka, he finally closed the book, ran his hands over his lips, and looked at me, and he barked, "You do the sports in L.A., right, for our station?" I nodded yes. We shook hands. He flapped the book at me. "You read this yet?" I nodded no. "Read it," he commanded. "It's about everybody I've ever known. And, God damn it, it's all true." Dick Butkus did not say another word. The last I ever saw of him, he was dancing nimbly, and he was 6'3" and at least 250 pounds, dancing nimbly down a very tiny set of stairs onto the tarmac at LAX, all the while still reading that book and still grunting. Recently, he and I had corresponded. Dick wanted to know if I was taking care of myself, or if the political world was wearing me down, and how I should look out for that. He had tweeted a selfie from the Bears' first game last month. He looked terrific. There was a lot going on inside the big man. Dick Butkus would have been 81 years old in December. From baseball, amid reports of some kind of scandal over some kind of improper use of the injury list, the general manager of the New York Mets, Billy Epler, has resigned. My friend Steve Gelbs, the in-game reporter for the Mets telecast, tweeted this news by noting, quote, "In a shocking move." Well, what's shocking about it? I told you Tuesday Billy Epler would be gone, because Epler had just fired the Mets manager, Buck Showalter, on the premise that the team had just hired a new president of baseball operations, David Stearns. And to, forgive me, quote myself, the premise was, Stearns gets to choose his own baseball people. If I'm general manager Billy Epler, I'm thinking, wait, I'm in baseball, and I'm a people. Am I going to get fired too? Wait, what's that look on Billy's face? Meanwhile, in a genuinely shocking move, the New York Post newspaper, well, that's an exaggeration. The New York Post has defended pitcher Trevor Bauer, suspended for 2 years by Major League Baseball and then thrown out of Japanese baseball after a series of women had accused him of battery and violence and sexual-style assault. Quote, "Media lynch mob was way off in ex-MLB star Trevor Bauer's rape case," read the headline. Then the article in the New York Post featured one story of one accuser and asked, "Where does Trevor Bauer go to get his reputation back?" Seems to me the Post needs to worry instead about getting its reputation back. Right now, it is the paper that has defended the appalling athlete Trevor Bauer. Well, ex-athlete. Still ahead on Countdown, that which combines Thurber and Red Barber and baseball and non-attempted murder. The Catbird Seat by James Thurber. First, time for the daily roundup of the miscreants, morons, and Dunning-Kruger effect specimens who constitute today's worst persons in the world. The bronze. In this world of Republicans believing neither in a democracy or a republic or representative government, you tend to no longer notice places like Fox that have been cheating and lying and advocating for fascism for years. But every once in a while, they earn their way back onto this list. Yesterday morning, Fox and friends joined the apparent decision by the propaganda channel to abandon Ron DeSantis' presidential candidacy to instead try to buttress that of Nikki Haley. They interviewed a, quote, Republican voter and Air Force veteran from New Hampshire named Melinda Tarango to explain why she switched to supporting Haley and why Haley's doing so well in New Hampshire. And she gushed and talked about Haley this and Haley that. Not once did anybody mention that the guest, Melinda Taranjo, is New Hampshire state co-chair of Nikki Haley for president. What a coincidence, Fox! What a coincidence! Honestly, nationalize News Corp. Seize them and replace all the programming on all their networks with refeeds of PBS. The runners-up, Target stores. They've announced they are closing 9 of their retail stores across the nation, and they have fed this Republican trope that the law has failed, and they had to do this because of out-of-control shoplifters, and it turns out, sure looks like Target is lying. The news site Popular Information analyzed some of the closures. The store Target is closing in Harlem had the lowest number of shoplifting reports of all of its stores in Upper Manhattan this year. The store Target is closing in San Francisco, same thing, 23 shoplifting episodes. Another store that they're keeping open nearby, 385. Seattle, same thing. This looks like Target made some bad overstock decisions, and it's trying to make it look like it's not being run by a bunch of idiots, and instead blaming those awful liberal cities. Also, why are you shopping at Target? But our winners, Sage Steele and Bill Maher. These are not the worst 2 people I've ever worked with out of the 20 or 30,000, but they are top 10, and one event in which they screw something up this big together? There ought to be a holiday declared. Steele, who got fired by ESPN after she attacked President Obama for identifying as black and attacked the network's COVID vaccination requirements, and because they had not fired her over the previous 14 years she worked there, to which I say, bravo, you ESPN executives and staffers. Your bravery is more than I could have achieved. Steele is now being pitched as a Republican candidate for the area surrounding, but not including the ESPN campus in Connecticut. She went on Maher's podcast, and she told Maher that when she interviewed President Biden in 2021, it was, quote, the saddest thing, because she thought he was confused and, quote, couldn't finish his sentences. Okay, I think I speak for everybody who ever co-anchored with Sage Steele on SportsCenter when I say, or worked with her, when I say, of course Biden couldn't finish his sentences. She was talking to him, and wherever and whenever you talk to Sage Steele, she has never let anybody finish their sentences. She constantly interrupts and talks over them. Steele also mocked Biden to Maher by telling of what went on before their interview began. So I can hear him, and he goes, what is this for? Wait, what's her name? I was going, oh my God. Apart from the fact that nobody knows who Sage Steele is, nor should the President of the United States be expected to, it was Sage Steele who in 2019 did not know enough about open microphones and television and who might be able to hear her before a show actually started, that she chose that moment to insult and abuse me to the producer, a minute to air, and then when I told her I could hear her, she laughed and pretended she had not been talking about me. Steele mocked Biden for telling stories of his career as an athlete. The interview, of course, was for the pregame show for the opening of the 2021 baseball season. Also, what are you going to talk to Sage Steele about? Policy? Quote, I thought it was so sad because I realized that's why he was in the basement during the whole election cycle, because even then he couldn't finish his sentences. He struggled. This is the kind of nitwit Sage Steele is. She read somewhere, or had it read to her, that Biden, quote, was in the basement during the whole election cycle, which he was not, even though there was a pandemic, which evidently she does not believe was real. But she was told this, and as a good little Republican nitwit, she believed it. And nowhere in any of her complaints about Biden's on-air performance was the recognition that the president does have a speech impediment, which comes out especially when he's tired, and which is a pretty good explanation if you seem to be struggling while doing an interview with some nitwitted sportscaster. Now, Sage Steele does not have a speech impediment, yet ESPN SportsCenter producers and their bosses and the executives and upper management explained to me the first time I worked with her that the series of pre-recorded segments of play-by-play or interviews that used to precede stories that she read on the show, the so-called stamps. There's a Tom Brady story, so here's play-by-play for 30 seconds of Tom Brady, that kind of thing. They were put in the show to make sure she had no opportunity to try to talk to the other anchor or to ad-lib, and could only read the script sitting in front of her that was written for her. She has never said anything ad-lib that wasn't unbelievably stupid. We can't risk it, one executive told me. And as to Bill Maher, who platformed her, I don't think I'm telling anything out of school here. Anybody who's met Bill Maher knows this. But since my first appearance on one of his shows in 2000, I have been told by a series of his producers never to bring any women with me to the show because if they were attractive, he would hit on them. And that if I couldn't understand why a particular woman was one of his guests on one of the shows I was appearing on, it was because he was hitting on them. Sage Steele and Bill... I wonder why he was interviewing Sage Steele Maher, today's worst persons in the world, and also morons. To the number one story on the countdown, and since it is the weekend edition, it's time for some James Thurber. The catbird seat combines two of my all-time favorite things, Thurber and baseball broadcasting. As Thurber will reveal in the story, the title comes from a catchphrase used by the Brooklyn Dodgers legendary announcer Red Barber, the man who trained Vin Scully, and is my late friend Vin's only true competition for greatest baseball play-by-play man of all time. I met Red Barber once. I interviewed him for CNN. He called me Keith throughout the interview. I was so starstruck, it's pretty much all I remember from the interview. Anyway, Burt Lancaster bought the movie rights to this story, and he got Billy Wilder to commit to direct it. Well, how come you've never heard of this perfect-sounding film, The Catbird Seat, directed by Billy Wilder? They sold the rights, and in 1960 the film was made, but they relocated it from Manhattan to Scotland, starring Peter Sellers dressed up as an old man as Mr. Martin. It's okay, unless you've read the story or had it read to you. From the Thurber Carnival, 1945, The Catbird Seat by James Thurber. Mr. Martin bought the pack of Camels on Monday night in the most crowded cigar store on Broadway. It was theater time, and 7 or 8 men were buying cigarettes. The clerk didn't even glance at Mr. Martin, who put the pack in his overcoat pocket and went out. If any of the staff at F&S had seen him buy the cigarettes, they would have been astonished, for it was generally known that Mr. Martin did not smoke and never had. No one saw him. It was just a week to the day since Mr. Martin had decided to rub out Mrs. Old Jean Barrows. The term rub out pleased him because it suggested nothing more than the correction of an error. In this case, an error of Mr. Fitweiler. Mr. Martin had spent each night of the past week working out his plan and examining it. As he walked home now, he went over it again. For the 100th time, he resented the element of imprecision, the margin of guesswork that entered into the business. The project, as he had worked it out, was casual and bold. The risks were considerable. Something might go wrong anywhere along the line. And therein lay the cunning of his scheme. No one would ever see in the cautious, painstaking hand of Irwin Martin, head of the filing department at F&S, of whom Mr. Fitweiler had once said, "Man is fallible, but Martin isn't." No one would see his hand, that is, unless he were caught in the act. Sitting in his apartment, drinking a glass of milk, Mr. Martin reviewed his case against Mrs. Old Jean Barrows, as he had every night for 7 nights. He began at the beginning. Her quacking voice and braying laugh had first profaned the halls of F&S on March 7th, 1941. Mr. Martin had a head for dates. Old Roberts, the personnel chief, had introduced her as the newly appointed special advisor to the president of the firm, Mr. Fitweiler. The woman had appalled Mr. Martin instantly, but he had not shown it. He had given her his dry hand, a look of studious concentration and a faint smile. "Well," she said, looking at the papers on his desk, "are you lifting the ox cart out of the ditch?" As Mr. Martin recalled that moment over his milk, he squirmed slightly. He must keep his mind on her crimes as a special advisor, not on her peccadillos as a personality. This he found difficult to do, in spite of entering an objection and sustaining it. The faults of the woman as a woman kept chattering on in his mind like an unruly witness. She had, for almost 2 years now, baited him in the halls, in the elevator, even in his own office, into which she romped now and then like a circus horse. She was constantly shouting these silly questions at him. "Are you lifting the ox cart out of the ditch? Are you tearing up the pea patch? Are you hollering down the rain barrel? Are you scraping around the bottom of the pickle barrel? Are you sitting in the catbird seat?" It was Joey Hart, one of Mr. Martin's 2 assistants, who had explained what the gibberish meant. "She must be a Dodger fan," he had said. "Red Barber announces the Dodger games over the radio, and he uses these expressions. Picked them up down south." Joey had gone on to explain 1 or 2. Tearing up the pea patch meant going on a rampage. Sitting in the catbird seat meant sitting pretty, like a batter with 3 balls and no strikes on him. Mr. Martin dismissed all this with an effort. It had been annoying. It had driven him near to distraction, but he was too solid a man to be moved to murder by anything so childish. It was unfortunate, he reflected, as he passed on to the important charges against Mrs. Barrows, that he had stood up under it so well. He had maintained always an outward appearance of polite tolerance. "Why, I even believe you like the woman," Miss Peard, his other assistant, had once said to him. He had simply smiled. A gavel rapped in Mr. Martin's mind, and the case proper was resumed. Mrs. Eugene Barrows stood charged with willful, blatant, and persistent attempts to destroy the efficiency and system of FNS. It was competent, material, and relevant to review her advent and rise to power. Mr. Martin had got the story from Miss Peard, who seemed always able to find things out. According to her, Mrs. Barrows had met Mr. Fitweiler at a party where she had rescued him from the embraces of a powerfully built drunken man who had mistaken the president of F&S for a famous retired Middle Western football coach. She had led him to a sofa and somehow worked upon him a monstrous magic. The aging gentleman had jumped to the conclusion there and then that this was a woman of singular attainments, equipped to bring out the best in him and in the firm. A week later, he had introduced her into F&S as his special advisor. On that day, confusion got its foot in the door. After Miss Tyson, Mr. Brundage, and Mr. Bartlett had been fired, and Mr. Munson had taken his hat and stalked out, mailing in his resignation letter, old Roberts had been emboldened to speak to Mr. Fitweiler. He mentioned that Mr. Munson's department had become a little disrupted, and hadn't they perhaps better resume the old system there? Mr. Fitweiler had said certainly not. He had the greatest faith in Mrs. Barrows' ideas. They require a little seasoning. Little seasoning is all, he had added. Mr. Roberts had given it up. Mr. Martin reviewed in detail all the changes wrought by Mrs. Barrows. She had begun chipping at the cornices of the firm's edifice, and now she was swinging at the foundation stones with a pickaxe. Mr. Martin came now, in his summing up, to the afternoon of Monday, November 2, 1942, just 1 week ago. On that day, at 3 p.m., Mrs. Barrows had bounced into his office. "Boo!" she had yelled. "Are you scraping around the bottom of the pickle barrel?" Mr. Martin had looked at her from under his green eye shade, saying nothing. She had begun to wander about the office, taking it in with her great, popping eyes. "Do you really need all these filing cabinets?" she had demanded suddenly. Mr. Martin's heart had jumped. "Each of these files," he had said, keeping his voice even, "plays an indispensable part in the system of F&S. She had brayed at him, "Well, don't tear up the pea patch," and gone to the door. From there she had bawled, "But you sure have got a lot of fine scrap in here." Mr. Martin could no longer doubt that the finger was on his beloved department. Her pickaxe was on the upswing, poised for the first blow. It had not come yet. He had received no blue memo from the enchanted Mr. Fitweiler bearing nonsensical instructions deriving from this obscene woman. But there was no doubt in Mr. Martin's mind that one would be forthcoming. He must act quickly. Already a precious week had gone by. Mr. Martin stood up in his living room, still holding his milk glass. "Gentlemen of the jury," he said to himself, "I demand the death penalty for this horrible person." The next day, Mr. Martin followed his routine as usual. He polished his glasses more often and once sharpened an already sharp pencil, but not even Miss Peard noticed. Only once did he catch sight of his victim. She swept past him in the hall with a patronizing, "Hi." At 5:30, he walked home as usual and had a glass of milk as usual. He had never drunk anything stronger in his life, unless you could count ginger ale. The late Sam Schlosser, the S of F&S, had praised Mr. Martin at a staff meeting several years before for his temperate habits. "One of our most efficient workers neither drinks nor smokes," he had said. "The results speak for themselves." Mr. Fitweiler had sat by, nodding approval. Mr. Martin was still thinking about that red letter day as he walked over to the Schrafft's restaurant on 5th Avenue near 46th Street. He got there, as he always did, at 8 o'clock. He finished his dinner and the financial page of the New York Sun at 8:45, as he always did. It was his custom after dinner to take a walk. This time he walked down 5th Avenue at a casual pace. His gloved hands felt moist and warm, his forehead cold. He transferred the camels from his overcoat to a jacket pocket. He wondered as he did so if they did not represent an unnecessary note of strain. Mrs. Barrows smoked only Luckies. It was his idea to puff a few puffs on a camel after the rubbing out, stub it out in the ashtray holding her lipstick saying Luckies, and thus drag a small red herring across the trail. Perhaps it was not a good idea. It would take time. He might even choke too loudly. Mr. Martin had never seen the house on West 12th Street where Mrs. Barrows lived, but he had a clear enough picture of it. Fortunately, she had bragged to everybody about her ducky first-floor apartment in the perfectly darling 3-story red brick. There would be no doorman or other attendants, just the tenants of the second and third floors. As he walked along, Mr. Martin realized that he would get there before 9:30. He had considered walking north on 5th Avenue from Schrafft's to a point from which it would take him until 10 o'clock to reach the house. At that hour, people were less likely to be coming in or going out. But the procedure would have made an awkward loop in the straight thread of his casualness, and he had abandoned it. It was impossible to figure when people would be entering or leaving the house anyway. There was a great risk at any hour. If he ran into anybody, he would simply have to place the rubbing out of old Jean Barrows in the inactive file forever. The same thing would hold true if there was someone in her apartment. In that case, he would just say that he had been passing by, recognized her charming house, and thought to drop in. It was 18 minutes after 9 when Mr. Martin turned into 12th Street. A man passed him, and a man and a woman talking. There was no one within 50 paces when he came to the house, halfway down the block. He was up the steps and in the small vestibule in no time, pressing the bell under the card that said Mrs. Olgene Barrows. When the clicking in the lock started, he jumped forward against the door. He got inside fast, closing the door behind him. A bulb in a lantern hung from the hall ceiling on a chain seemed to give a monstrously bright light. There was nobody on the stair, which went up ahead of him along the left wall. A door opened down the hall in the wall on the right. He went toward it swiftly on tiptoe. "Well, for God's sakes, look who's here," bawled Mrs. Barrows, and her braying laugh rang out like the report of a shotgun. He rushed past her like a football attacker, bumping her. "Hey, quit shoving," she said, closing the door behind them. They were in her living room, which seemed to Mr. Martin to be lighted by 100 lamps. "What's after you?" she said. "You're as jumpy as a goat." He found he was unable to speak. His heart was wheezing in his throat. Yes, he finally brought out. She was jabbering and laughing as she started to help him off with his coat. No, he said. "I'll put it here." He took it off and put it on a chair near the door. "Your hat and gloves, too," she said. "You're in a lady's house." He put his hat on top of the coat. Mrs. Barrows seemed larger than he had thought. He kept his gloves on. "I was passing by," he said. I recognized. Is there anyone here?" She laughed louder than ever. "No," she said. "We're all alone. You're white as a sheet, you funny man. Whatever has come over you. I'll mix you a toddy." She started toward a door across the room. "Scotch and soda be all right? But say, you don't drink, do you?" She turned and gave him her amused look. Mr. Martin pulled himself together. "Scotch and soda will be all right," he heard himself say. He could hear her laughing in the kitchen. Mr. Martin looked quickly around the living room for the weapon. He had counted on finding one there. There were andirons and a poker and something in a corner that looked like an Indian club. None of them would do. It couldn't be that way. He began to pace around. He came to a desk. On it lay a metal paper knife with an ornate handle. Would it be sharp enough? He reached for it and knocked over a small brass jar. Stamps spilled out of it and fell onto the floor with a clatter. "Hey!" Mrs. Barrows yelled from the kitchen. "Are you tearing up the pea patch?" Mr. Martin gave a strange laugh. Picking up the knife, he tried its point against his left wrist. It was blunt. It wouldn't do. When Mrs. Barrows reappeared carrying 2 highballs, Mr. Martin, standing there with his gloves on, became acutely conscious of the fantasy he had wrought. Cigarettes in his pocket, a drink prepared for him. It was all too grossly improbable. It was more than that. It was impossible. Somewhere, in the back of his mind, a vague idea stirred, sprouted. "For heaven's sake, take off those gloves," said Mrs. Barrows. "I always wear them in the house," said Mr. Martin. The idea began to bloom, strange and wonderful. She put the glasses on a coffee table in front of a sofa and sat on the sofa. "Come over here, you odd little man," she said. Mr. Martin went over and sat beside her. It was difficult getting a cigarette out of the pack of Camels, but he managed it. She held a match for him, laughing. "Well," she said, handing him his drink, "this is perfectly marvelous. You, with a drink and a cigarette." Mr. Martin puffed, not too awkwardly, and took a gulp of the highball. "I drink and smoke all the time," he said. He clinked his glass against hers. "Here's nuts to that old windbag Fitweiler," he said, and gulped again. The stuff tasted awful, but he made no grimace. "Really, Mr. Martin," she said, her voice and posture changing, "you are insulting our employer." Mrs. Barrows was now all special advisor to the president. "I am preparing a bomb," said Mr. Martin, "which will blow the old goat higher than hell." He had only had a little of the drink, which was not strong. It couldn't be that. "Do you take dope or something?" Mrs. Barrows asked coldly. "Heroin," said Mr. Martin. "I'll be coked to the gills when I bump that old buzzard off." "Mr. Martin," she shouted, getting to her feet, "that will be all of that. You must go at once." Mr. Martin took another swallow of the drink. He tapped his cigarette out in the ashtray and put the pack of Camels on the coffee table. Then he got up. She stood glaring at him. He walked over and put on his hat and coat. "Not a word about this," he said, and laid an index finger against his lips. All Mrs. Barrows could bring out was a, "Really?" Mr. Martin put his hand on the doorknob. "I'm sitting in the catbird seat," he said. He stuck his tongue out at her and left. Nobody saw him go. Mr. Martin got to his apartment walking well before 11. No one saw him go in. He had 2 glasses of milk after brushing his teeth, and he felt elated. It wasn't tipsiness, because he hadn't been tipsy. Anyway, the walk had worn off all effects of the whiskey. He got in bed and read a magazine for a while. He was asleep before midnight. Mr. Martin got to the office at 8:30 the next morning, as usual. At 8:45, old Jean Barrows, who had never before arrived at work before 10, swept into his office. "I'm reporting to Mr. Fitweiler now," she shouted. "If he turns you over to the police, it's no more than you deserve." Mr. Martin gave her a look of shocked surprise. "I beg your pardon," he said. Mrs. Barrows snorted and bounced out of the room, leaving Miss Peard and Joey Hart staring after her. "What's the matter with that old devil now?" asked Miss Peard. "I have no idea," said Mr. Martin, resuming his work. The other 2 looked at him and then at each other. Miss Peard got up and went out. She walked slowly past the closed door of Mr. Fitweiler's office. Mrs. Barrows was yelling inside, but she was not braying. Miss Peard could not hear what the woman was saying. She went back to her desk. 45 minutes later, Mrs. Barrows left the president's office and went into her own, shutting the door. It wasn't until half an hour later that Mr. Fitweiler sent for Mr. Martin. The head of the filing department, neat, quiet, attentive, stood in front of the old man's desk. Mr. Fitweiler was pale and nervous. He took his glasses off and twiddled them. He made a small ruffing sound in his throat. "Martin," he said, "you have been with us more than 20 years. 22, sir," said Mr. Martin. "In that time," pursued the president, "your work and your manner have been exemplary." "I trust so, sir," said Mr. Martin. "I have understood, Martin," said Mr. Fitweiler, "that you have never taken a drink or smoked." "That is correct, sir," said Mr. Martin. "Ah, yes." Mr. Fitweiler polished his glasses. "You may describe what you did after leaving the office yesterday, Martin," he said. "Certainly, sir," he said. "I walked home, then I went to Schraft's for dinner. Afterward, I walked home again. I went to bed early, sir, and read a magazine for a while. I was asleep before 11. "Ah, yes," said Mr. Fitweiler again. He was silent for a moment, searching for the proper words to say to the head of the filing department. "Mrs. Barrows," he said finally, "Mrs. Barrows has worked hard, Martin. Very hard. It grieves me to report that she has suffered a severe breakdown. It has taken the form of a persecution complex accompanied by distressing hallucinations." "I'm very sorry, sir," said Mr. Martin. "Mrs. Barrows is under the delusion," continued Mr. Fitweiler, "that you visited her last evening and behaved yourself in an unseemly manner." He raised his hand to silence Mr. Martin's little pained outcry. "It is the nature of these psychological diseases," Mr. Fitweiler said, "to fix upon the least likely and most innocent party as the source of persecution. These matters are not for the lay mind to grasp, Martin. I've just had my psychiatrist, Dr. Fitch, on the phone. He would not, of course, commit himself, but he made enough generalizations to substantiate my suspicions. I suggested to Mrs. Barrows, when she had completed her story to me this morning, that she visit Dr. Fitch. For I suspected a condition at once. She flew, I regret to say, into a rage and requested that I call you on the carpet. You may not know, Martin, but Mrs. Barrows had planned a reorganization of your department. Subject to my approval, of course, subject to my approval. This brought you rather than anyone else to her mind, but again, that is a phenomenon for Dr. Finch, and not for us. So, Martin, I'm afraid Mrs. Barrows' usefulness here is at an end. I'm dreadfully sorry, sir, said Mr. Martin. It was at this point that the door to the office blew open with the suddenness of a gas main explosion, and Mrs. Barrows catapulted through it. "Is the little rat denying it?" she screamed. "He can't get away with that!" Mr. Martin got up and moved discreetly to a point beside Mr. Fitweiler's chair. "You drank and smoked at my apartment," she bawled at Mr. Martin, "and you know it. You called Mr. Fitweiler an old windbag and said you were going to blow him up when you got coked to your gills on your heroin." She stopped yelling to catch her breath, and a new glint came into her popping eyes. "If you weren't such a drab, ordinary little man," she said, "I'd think you'd planned it all, sticking your tongue out, saying you were sitting in the cat-buried seat because you thought no one would believe me when I told it. My God, it's really too perfect." She brayed loudly and hysterically, and the fury was on her again. She glared at Mr. Fitweiler. "Can't you see how he has tricked us, you old fool? Can't you see his little game?" But Mr. Fitweiler had been surreptitiously pressing all the buttons under the top of his desk, and employees of F&S began pouring into the room. "Stockton," said Mrs. Fitweiler, "you and Fishbein will take Mrs. Barrows to her home. Mrs. Powell, you will go with them." Stockton, who had played a little football in high school, blocked Mrs. Barrows as she made for Mr. Martin. It took him and Fishbein together to force her out of the door into the hall, crowded with stenographers and office boys. She was still screaming imprecations at Mr. Martin, tangled and contradictory imprecations. The hubbub finally died out down the corridor. "I regret that this has happened," said Mr. Fitweiler. "I shall ask you to dismiss it from your mind, Martin." "Yes, sir," said Mr. Martin, anticipating his chiefs. "That will be all," by moving to the door. "I will dismiss it." He went out and shut the door, and his step was light and quick in the hall. When he entered his department, he had slowed down to his customary gait, and he walked quietly across the room to the W-20 file, wearing a look of studious concentration. From the Thurber Carnival, The Catbird Seat by James Thurber. I've done all the damage I can do here. Thank you for listening. Countdown has come to you from the Vin Scully studio at the Olbermann Broadcasting Empire in New York. The music you heard was, for the most part, arranged, produced, and performed by the Countdown musical directors John Philip Chanel and Brian Ray. Brian Ray handled guitars, bass, and drums. John Philip Chanel did the orchestration and keyboards. It was produced by TKO Brothers. Other music, including other Beethoven songs, the hits of 1776, were arranged and performed by No Horns Allowed. The sports music is courtesy of ESPN Inc. and was written by Mitch Warren Davis. We call it the Olbermann theme from ESPN2. Our satirical and pithy musical comments are by Nancy Faust, the best baseball stadium organist ever. Our announcer today was my friend Dennis Leary. Everything else was pretty much my fault. So that's Countdown for this, the 1,004th day since Donald Trump's first attempted coup against the democratically elected government of the United States. Convict him now while we still can. The next scheduled countdown is Tuesday. Bulletins as the news warrants. Till then, I'm Keith Olbermann. Good morning, good afternoon, good night, and good luck.